We begin with the President of the United States addressing the nation and calling for a massive investment in this country's infrastructure, rebuffing the idea of giant tax breaks for the richest Americans, and warning anyone who would dare touch Social Security to keep their hands off. You want to talk about red meat for the base? Listen to some of the language the president used. Workers have a right to organize into unions and to bargain collectively with their employers. And a strong, free labor movement is an invigorating and necessary part of our industrial society. Wow. How about this one? Only a fool would try to deprive working men and women of their right to join the union of their choice. Listen to the way he goes after the right here. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things, but their number is negligible. And the president says their number is negligible, and they are stupid. That is not what Barack Obama said last night. In fact, that is way to the left of any national Democrat at this point. That was all Republican President Dwight David Eisenhower. That was all stuff he said when he was president. Republican President Dwight Eisenhower. President when the top tax bracket for the richest people in this country was 92%. President Eisenhower defended that tax bracket. He said we cannot afford to reduce taxes until, quote, the factors of income and outgo will be balanced. Eisenhower insisting that there must be a balanced budget and that taxes on the rich are the way to balance it. Dwight Eisenhower, noted leftist. The Republican Party platform of Eisenhower's 1956 called for expansion of Social Security, broadened unemployment insurance, better health protection for all of our people. It called for voting rights, full voting rights for D.C. It called for expanding the minimum wage to cover more workers. It called for improved job safety for workers, equal pay for workers regardless of sex. This is the Republican Party circa 1956. The Republican Party. The story of modern American politics writ large is the story of your father's and your grandfather's Republican Party now being way to the left of today's leftiest liberals. If Dwight Eisenhower were running for office today, he would have to run, I'm guessing, as an independent and not as some Joe Lieberman in between the parties independent. He'd be a Bernie Sanders independent. In 1982, who passed the largest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history? That would be Ronald Reagan. Who called for comprehensive health reform legislation during his State of the Union address in 1974? A program that was well to the left of what either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama ultimately proposed? That would be Richard Nixon. Eisenhower and Reagan and Nixon, they were not the liberals of their day. They were the conservatives of their own time. But the whole of American politics has shifted so far to the right in the last 50 years that what used to be thought of as conservative, what used to be thought of as a conservative position, is now considered to be off the charts lefty. Former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens pointed out this whole phenomenon of American politics shifting to the right when he told the New York Times this. He said, quote, including myself, every judge who's been appointed to the court since Lewis Powell in 1971 has been more conservative than his or her predecessor, except maybe Justice Ginsburg. That was the one exception he could come up with. Over the past half a century, the center in American politics has gone further and further and further to the right. Halfway through Barack Obama's first term, his State of the Union address last night is being pretty universally hailed as centrist, as not too liberal, not too conservative, but right down the middle of American politics. And that is something that Americans like to hear. The instant reaction polls to President Obama's speech last night were almost comically positive. CBS reported that 92% of the people who watched the speech approved of Mr. Obama's proposals. 92. CNN reporting that 84% of people had a positive response. Those sorts of numbers do not happen in politics. Those are crazy numbers. Historically, the process of a Democrat trying to find the center in politics has seen Democrats chasing the center as it moves to the right. The thing that's different about the left and the right in this country is that there isn't an equal and opposite force on the left that's anything like the conservative movement on the right. The conservative movement exists outside the Republican Party, and it serves to constantly pull the Republican Party further to the right. So when you have a president like Bill Clinton, who found popular centrist decisions by splitting the difference between where the Republicans were and where the Democrats were and where the Republicans were, and the Republicans kept moving further to the right because they're being pulled there by the conservative movement, when you have a president who triangulates like that, what you end up with is a president who, as a Democrat, moves the country further to the right because he shifts to the right every time he takes another centrist position. Is Barack Obama doing the same thing? The dynamics on the right are same as they've ever been. The rightward drift of Republican politics from Eisenhower to Nixon to Ford to Reagan to Bush Sr. to Bush Jr., it's less of a steady drift now than a fast rightward jerking motion. The rightward movement in Republican politics is going faster, I think, than it ever has before. For example, George W. Bush, he ran for president on a platform of comprehensive immigration reform. He ran for president saying that he supported the assault weapons ban. But by the time he was president, supporting the assault weapons ban was no longer all that tenable, so he let that ban expire. He did try for immigration reform, then he abandoned it, then his entire party ran against him on it by the time they needed a new presidential nominee. It was a quick turnaround. You know, it was only 2008 when John McCain and Sarah Palin ran for office by saying they supported a cap-and-trade energy program. Remember that? Cap and trade used to be their idea, used to be a Republican idea. The individual mandate for health reform, that used to be a Republican idea. The DREAM Act on immigration, that was sponsored by John McCain once upon a time. But by the time Democrats brought it up for a vote, John McCain had turned against his own idea. Why? Because Republican politics are jerking so fast to the right that Republicans are being forced to turn against their own policy positions when the new right-wing position dictates it. They can't even keep up within their own careers. On the right, the process that has dragged the political center to the point where Dwight Eisenhower would be denounced as a socialist now. Ronald Reagan wouldn't even pass a Republican purity test. He'd be the guy they excluded from the debates for being a wingnut. That process is still very much intact. On the right, things are working sort of the way they always have, if not faster. But heading into last night's State of the Union address, the question was, would President Obama continue to chase Republicans to the right? There are two ways to approach this, right? There are two ways to claim the 92% instant approval rating of sounding like the man in the center. One way is the Clintonian way, to let your policies just drift right because the Republicans drifted right too. But there's another way, a way we heard about last night. It is to claim the center, to claim the political spoils you get for sounding like you're in the center, that 92% CBS rating, right? But to put the center somewhere back vaguely where the center actually is.
None of this will be easy. All of it will take time. And it will be harder because we will argue about everything. The costs, the details, the letter of every law. Of course, some countries don't have this problem. If the central government wants a railroad, they build a railroad, no matter how many homes get bulldozed. If they don't want a bad story in the newspaper, it doesn't get written. And yet, as contentious and frustrating and messy as our democracy can sometimes be, I know there isn't a person here who would trade places with any other nation on earth.
The president further erasing the relevance of that aisle in the room by bringing everybody in the chamber to their feet. There were a few, but only a few moments in that speech last night when only Democrats or only Republicans came to their feet. But when President Obama made specific policy proposals, he did not move the center further to the right. He rang the centrist bell, and he racked up more approval points, I'm sure. For example, when he said that he would cut the corporate tax rate, because that sounds like a very conservative idea. It's the sort of thing that Republicans proposed. But in terms of its real impact, 2/3 of U.S. corporations paid no federal income taxes, according to a recent government study. The General Electric Corporation, God bless them, they own us for now, they paid no federal income taxes in 2009. So giving a company like that a corporate tax cut means nothing. You want to know what would make a huge difference? This would.
Over the years, a parade of lobbyists has rigged the tax code to benefit particular companies and industries. Those with accountants or lawyers to work the system can end up paying no taxes at all. But all the rest are hit with one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. It makes no sense, and it has to change.
In terms of real policy, in terms of real governing, not just tone, but actual substance, if corporate tax loopholes close, so companies actually have to pay more taxes than you do next year, that would be change a lot of people can believe in. That would be a bigger deal than what happens to the corporate tax rate, since a lot of companies avoid being taxed at all anyway. President Obama rang the centrist bell again last night when he talked about debts and deficit, the need to control spending. It's, of course, wildly popular to talk about that in the abstract. It always has been. But it is wildly unpopular when you get to the specifics. Even now, with everybody talking about how much they love the idea of spending cuts, look at how unpopular it is to propose cutting any of these things. Gallup reporting 67% of people opposed to cuts in education, 64% of Americans opposed to cuts in Social Security, 61% opposed to cuts in Medicare. The way that President Obama held the center in the center and didn't let the right drag this one over too was by making the case for investment. There is stuff, he said, that the government ought to spend money on. We ought to spend money on education. We ought to spend money on upgrading our technology. We ought to spend money on science, not because we've got money to waste, but because our economy will never grow if we don't do that. That is a fundamental rejection of the way conservatives talk about government now. It's a fundamental rejection of the way that conservatives talk about how the country should work. And President Obama had the country nodding along with him last night as he said it. Look at that, 92%. Wrenching the center back from the right and putting it back in the actual center. Once you've got everybody agreeing to that sort of a general principle, you can then make proposals that are actually liberal, and it won't upset anyone. And I don't just mean like sort of vaguely liberal sounding proposals. I mean like Eisenhower liberal. Like the president's case last night for national investment to have a high-speed broadband access all across the country, to have 98% of the country connected to broadband within the next 5 years. Bill Clinton would not have proposed that as a centrist idea. This is an Eisenhower leftist idea. This is an interstate highway idea. The idea that government needs to make this happen because even if no individual business is going to find this to be a profitable thing to do, the country needs this to happen so we can compete as a nation. If you want to know where the sweet spot is in American politics, where you can get mom and apple pie style approval ratings, there's two ways to do it. One is if the country feels like we are threatened by somebody else. That will bring us together like nothing else. The other way is to sound like you are the reasonable center, that you have risen above the fray and you are the one who makes sense between the extremes. That is how Bill Clinton came back after his own shellacking in the 1994 midterms, and then he coasted to re-election in 1996. When he sprinted to the center, though, he sprinted to where Republicans and the conservative movement had put the center. He moved his whole policy agenda to the right and thereby let the Republicans and the conservatives go even further right in order to keep the tension on, in order to keep pulling things to the conservative side. What we learned last night about this president and how he is doing it differently is that he is very happy to reap the political rewards that come with positioning yourself in the center. But he's also putting the center back where he wants it. He's sort of stopping the country's rightward drift. Turns out elections do have consequences. We will be right back with New York Times columnist Frank Rich.